There are names that fade silently with the passage of time, absorbed by the routine of the news cycle and collective forgetfulness. And there are other names that refuse to disappear, names that remain suspended in whispers, resurface in digital debates, and return again and again. Not because the story has been completely told, but precisely because it has not. Yu Menglong is one of those names. At first glance, his story seemed tragically simple. A talented actor, a demanding industry, a sudden death that left fans and colleagues plunged into mourning and confusion. Official statements offered condolences, a clear timeline, and carefully worded conclusions. However, beneath that orderly surface, something did not quite fit. The subsequent silence felt heavy. The explanations seemed incomplete. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, questions began to arise. These unsettling stories are not simple cold headlines on a screen. They are precise cuts into the darkest corners of human nature, where power, fear, and control intersect without making a sound. And it is precisely that silent intersection that makes them so difficult to ignore. To ensure you do not miss any of the upcoming files, none of the criminal portraits we are about to open, subscribe now and activate notifications, because in the world of crime and influence, the truth does not age. Yu Menglong was not an unknown figure living in the shadows. He was a meticulously managed public figure, presented with care and closely tied to contracts that shaped his career. And, according to various subsequent claims, also his personal freedom. Behind the polished interviews and controlled appearances operated a system designed to maximize profits and minimize risks. A system that is rarely seen from the outside, but which defines every movement from within. At the center of that system was his representative, an administrator publicly described as an efficient professional behind the scenes. However, after Yu Menglong's death, accounts began to circulate portraying him as something more than a simple manager. Attention no longer focused solely on what had happened, but on who remained silent. While one figure disappeared from the public spotlight, another emerged with unexpected force. Faniki, a colleague of Yu Menglong, appeared before the cameras visibly altered, disoriented, and emotionally fractured. Some interpreted his behavior as a genuine manifestation of grief. Others saw in that instability a possible strategy. That ambiguity, far from dissipating, became one of the central pillars of the mystery that was beginning to take shape. What makes this case distinct from many other tragedies related to celebrities is not solely the accusations that emerged afterward, but who began to investigate them. Fans, netizens, and amateur analysts, armed with satellite images, archived videos, geolocation data, and unwavering determination, began to reconstruct an alternative narrative. A narrative that official channels seemed unable or unwilling to address directly. As we begin to examine the layers surrounding Yu Menglong's last days, one question stands above all others. Are we facing an isolated tragedy or the visible crack of a system designed to remain hidden? Before his name became wrapped in controversies, theories, and digital reconstructions, Yu Menglong was known for something much simpler. He was known for his work. On screen, his presence conveyed discipline, restraint, and reliability. He was not a figure associated with excess or scandal, but with an image carefully calibrated to fit the expectations of a demanding industry. Interviews underscored his professionalism. Press releases highlighted stability. From the outside, his career seemed to advance in an orderly, even predictable manner. However, that order did not stem solely from personal self-discipline. As happens with many rising artists, Yu Menglong's professional trajectory was shaped from early stages by contracts that regulated much more than shooting schedules. These agreements established conditions regarding public appearances, interactions with the press, commercial affiliations, and in certain cases, guidelines for personal conduct within the entertainment industry. This type of contract is not exceptional. They exist to protect significant financial investments and to maintain a consistency of image that the market demands. The problem pointed out by critics of the system does not reside in the existence of these contracts, but in the imbalance of power they can generate. When talent is young, replaceable, and dependent on future opportunities, the real capacity to negotiate is reduced. Autonomy does not disappear abruptly. It erodes slowly, presented as a necessary concession to survive in a competitive environment. Over time, decisions that once belonged to the individual begin to require external approval. At the center of Yu Menglong's professional orbit was his representative. Officially, his function was administrative and strategic. He organized schedules, negotiated contracts, and acted as an intermediary between the actor and the rest of the industry. In public discourse, his figure appeared, when mentioned, neutrally as that of an efficient professional fulfilling his role in the background. However, following Yu Menglong's death, different accounts began to circulate in fan communities and among anonymous voices in the sector. According to these versions, the representative's influence extended far beyond routine management. It was claimed that key career decisions required increasingly direct approval. Opportunities were filtered, communications were mediated, access to colleagues, media outlets, and even personal relationships became progressively more restricted. It is important to underscore that these claims have not been independently verified. They do not constitute legal proof. However, they gained traction because they fit with known patterns in other highly controlled entertainment ecosystems. In these environments, control is rarely exercised through open confrontation. It is introduced gradually, wrapped in the language of protection. The representative presents himself as a shield against the risks of the sector, the hostile press, and errors that can end a career irreversibly. With the passage of time, the artist does not become dependent due to incapacity, but because independence has been systematically discouraged. Autonomous decision-making begins to be perceived as dangerous. Obedience, conversely, is redefined as prudence. This process leaves no immediate visible traces. From the outside, everything seems to work. Some observers who retrospectively reviewed Yu Menglong's public appearances noted subtle changes. Interviews seemed more scripted. Answers became brief and carefully formulated. Personal anecdotes disappeared almost completely. None of this on its own constitutes evidence of misconduct. However, together it draws the portrait of a public figure operating within increasingly narrow limits. Behind the scenes, accusations began to circulate with greater insistence. There was talk of meticulous supervision of the flow of information. It was alleged that messages were monitored and that certain meetings might have been recorded. These claims, repeated in forums and social networks, remain unverified. Their strength did not come from concrete proof, but from their consistency with documented practices in other contexts of institutional control, both inside and outside of entertainment. What transformed these accusations from a persistent murmur into a central issue was the moment they emerged. In the months prior to Yu Menglong's death, fans began to notice unusual absences. Scheduled appearances were cancelled without public explanations. Online activity decreased. When the actor appeared before the public, some perceived tension in his behavior. These interpretations are inherently subjective, but they acquired weight in a context where official communication was minimal. This is where the concept of surveillance becomes key to understanding why this case captured so much attention. Modern surveillance does not always require visible cameras or explicit monitoring. It can be psychological. The simple belief of being watched modifies behavior. It reduces perceived options. It discourages dissent. Investigations into behavioral control have noted for decades that perceived surveillance can be as effective as actual supervision. According to later accounts, the operational methods attributed to Yu Menglong's management environment reflected this principle. Anonymous sources described a space where information was centralized and movements were tracked. Whether literal or metaphorical, this environment represented control as an organized structure, not as impulsive chaos. Decisions were not made in the heat of the moment. They followed procedures. Here is where Yu Menglong's story begins to differentiate itself from that of many other artists. The accusations do not describe a volatile relationship marked by public conflicts or emotional outbursts. They describe something quieter and, for some, more disturbing. A system where resistance is not met with direct confrontation, but with containment. From a legal point of view, the existence of control does not automatically imply illegality. Contracts are legitimate instruments. Certain forms of supervision are as well. The line is crossed only when coercion replaces consent, when restriction substitutes agreement, and when fear displaces choice. Determining where that line sits demands proof, not inferences. Nevertheless, the absence of clear proof did not prevent questions from multiplying. As Yu Menglong's death was made public, attention quickly shifted from mourning to scrutiny. Fans no longer wondered just how he died, but how he lived in the preceding months. They reviewed archived interviews, promotional recordings, and past appearances, looking for patterns they believed they had ignored. In that context, silence acquired a symbolic weight, and that silence, real or perceived, would become the fertile ground upon which the next phase of this case would be built. Unlike the majority of criminal cases that capture public attention, Yu Menglong's death was not anchored to a single defining moment. There was no crime scene cordoned off with tape. There was no widely disseminated official reconstruction, nor was there a sequence of facts unanimously recognized by authorities. Instead, what began to form was an expanding constellation of accusations, digital fragments, and constructed timelines assembled largely outside of institutional channels. That information void was the terrain where a distinct form of investigation emerged, not led by prosecutors or detectives, but by communities of followers, netizens, and amateur analysts, people without access to official files, but with time, digital tools, and a deep mistrust toward explanations perceived as insufficient. Piece by piece, they began to build a parallel narrative. The focal point of many of these reconstructions was a place that until then had no public relevance whatsoever, a villa located on the outskirts of Shanghai, described as ordinary in appearance and isolated by design. According to online researchers, this property became key, not because of what has been legally proven to have occurred there, but because of what multiple independent sources claimed might have happened behind its walls. Anonymous descriptions coincided on certain elements: high walls, dense hedges, limited visibility from surrounding roads. None of these characteristics is unusual for a high-profile private residence. What sparked interest were the claims about an advanced surveillance infrastructure, discreetly integrated cameras, motion detection systems that supposedly extended beyond the immediate perimeter, constant digital monitoring. If such claims were accurate, they would transform a dwelling into a controlled space, closer to a monitored zone than a home. None of these characteristics have been officially confirmed. However, they gained traction because they fit with a broader narrative that was already forming around the alleged methods of control attributed to Yu Menglong's management environment: centralization of information, restriction of movements, control exercised through the awareness of being watched. According to timelines elaborately produced by online communities, Yu Menglong's movements in the weeks prior to his death would have become progressively more limited. Public appearances decreased. Communication patterns changed. On the night of December 18th, several digital researchers claimed that the actor left a professional meeting visibly upset. This observation was based on video fragments and indirect testimonies, not on official documentation. Even so, it became a reference point around which subsequent theories developed. What happened after that night remains uncertain. Some versions maintain that Yu Menglong moved to the villa. Others suggest he was summoned there. From a legal point of view, this distinction is crucial. However, within the online discourse, the emphasis here shifted quickly from intent to environment. The question ceased to be why he went and became what conditions awaited him. The most debated accusation within this set of claims involves an alleged recorded confrontation. A video fragment that circulated in an incomplete and highly discussed manner reportedly captured a tense exchange between Menglong and his representative. Analysts who reviewed the clip described the actor as visibly anxious but firm, expressing concerns related to contracts, control, and unfulfilled promises. The response attributed to the representative was characterized as calm, controlled, and loaded with implicit warnings rather than open threats. It is fundamental to underscore that the authenticity of this material has not been confirmed. Its origin is disputed, its integrity is unknown, and there is no public forensic verification. However, its impact on the collective perception was significant. The clip, authentic or not, crystallized an abstract narrative of control into a concrete and emotionally potent image. The scenario described amplified that effect. The alleged presence of hidden cameras suggested a space designed not only to observe, but to document. In such environments, interactions are not ephemeral. They remain recorded, archived. This possibility gave rise to one of the most persistent questions of the case. Who controlled those recordings and for what purpose? Online communities began to explore this question with increasing intensity. They used geolocation tools, reviewed archived posts on social networks, and analyzed publicly accessible satellite images. They attempted to trace the movements of vehicles in the vicinity of the villa. A viral video showed a black SUV entering the property late at night. The license plate appeared partially hidden. The vehicle remained inside for several hours. On its own, that footage proved nothing. It could have been a private visit without relevance. However, within a narrative already loaded with suspicion, it became symbolic. For some, it suggested the transfer of evidence. For others, the movement of witnesses. For others still, simply a coincidence amplified by collective anxiety. Each interpretation carried distinct implications, but none could be confirmed without an official investigation. As these speculations accumulated, claims also emerged about the silence of possible witnesses. People associated with Yu Menglong supposedly disappeared from the public space in the same period. Social media accounts went inactive. Scheduled appearances were cancelled. Again, these absences could be explained by grief, legal counsel, or simple coincidence. But in an environment predisposed to suspicion, silence was rarely interpreted neutrally. Attention then shifted toward digital communication. Screenshots of encrypted messages began to circulate in forums and social platforms. The messages, difficult to authenticate and often edited, supposedly made reference to nocturnal movements, warnings against speaking in public, and the relocation of sensitive material. Analysts repeatedly warned that without verifiable metadata, such messages could not be considered evidence. Even so, they added another layer to an already dense web of inferences. What distinguishes this phase of the case is not the evidentiary strength of any individual claim, but the cumulative weight of many. No accusation stands on its own. Each one obtains perceived credibility by aligning with the others. A controlled environment, a tense confrontation, restricted movements, silence of witnesses, encrypted communication. Together, they form a narrative architecture that feels coherent, even in the absence of confirmation. That coherence is as convincing as it is dangerous. From a legal perspective, narratives built without a solid evidentiary base run the risk of collapsing under scrutiny. From a psychological perspective, human beings tend to seek patterns, especially when official explanations seem insufficient. While authorities remained largely silent, investigations driven by amateurs filled the void. Live streams analyzed videos frame by frame. Forums debated behavioral signs. Alternative timelines attempted to reconstruct minute by minute the last known hours of Yu Menglong. These reconstructions varied widely, but shared a central assumption: that something occurred within a controlled space and that its consequences extended beyond that space. At this point, the story remained suspended between accusation and proof. There was a formal imputation, there was no confirmed criminal act, only an accumulation of unresolved questions regarding power, pressure, and control. And while that focus intensified, attention began to shift from places and systems toward the people whose behavior seemed to reflect the same patterns under examination. As public attention intensified around the circumstances of Yu Menglong's death, the focus inevitably shifted from places and systems to people. Among all the figures linked to the case, none generated as much confusion or controversy as Shiki. Until then, considered simply a colleague within the same professional circle, his behavior following Yu Menglong's death turned him into a central point of speculation. In the hours and days that followed, Shiki appeared in public visibly altered. Interviews showed disorientation. His speech rhythm was irregular. Emotional responses oscillated between withdrawal and agitation. For many observers, these signals were interpreted as genuine expressions of grief. Reactions of this type are not uncommon following a sudden loss, especially when the pain is lived under the constant pressure of media exposure. However, as the weeks passed, a different interpretation began to circulate. Behavioral analysts and online commentators pointed out patterns they considered unusual. not because Faniki seemed unstable, but because the instability seemed to manifest recurrently at specific moments. Intense emotional episodes coincided with peaks in public attention, unverified leaks, or viral discussions related to the management environment and the villa mentioned by digital researchers. For some, the timing seemed precise rather than spontaneous. This observation gave rise to one of the most debated theories of the case, that Shiki's instability was not solely psychological, but potentially strategic. From a legal and clinical perspective, this is an extremely delicate claim. Mental suffering cannot be reliably evaluated from edited recordings or fragments disseminated on social networks. Authentic psychological crises often present inconsistently and defy any predictable pattern. Nevertheless, experts in behavioral analysis have pointed out that in certain contexts, deliberate distraction can be based on amplified unpredictability. Confusion works as a shield. Inconsistency becomes a form of plausible deniability. Within this interpretive framework, some observers identified characteristics that repeated in Shiki's public appearances. The first was selective memory. In several interviews, he seemed to recall trivial details clearly while avoiding or deflecting questions related to Yu Menglong's last days. The second was the presence of contradictory statements. Small discrepancies between different public accounts generated blurred timelines instead of clarifying them. The third was the avoidance of direct attributions. Shiki rarely mentioned concrete names or locations, even when referring to shared professional environments. None of these elements constitute evidence of deceit on their own. Each could be explained by trauma, legal caution, or media pressure. However, considered together, they formed an image that many found difficult to ignore. Adding to this complexity were claims about continuous digital communication. Screenshots supposedly showing encrypted messages involving Shiki began to circulate online. The content of these messages is a subject of dispute. Their origins are uncertain. Some appear to be significantly edited. Others lack verifiable metadata entirely. Analysts repeatedly warned that without forensic verification, this material cannot be considered proof. Despite these warnings, the messages fueled speculation that Shiki maintained contact with unseen actors, possibly coordinating narratives or managing the flow of information. This interpretation positioned Shiki not as an isolated individual in crisis, but as a node within a broader network. However, alternative interpretations emerged in parallel. Some argued that Faniki was not a manipulator, but a pawn. According to this view, he could have been subjected to pressure, coerced into silence or erratic public performance out of fear of professional or personal consequences. In environments of prolonged control, external instability can function as a survival mechanism rather than an offensive strategy. Appearing unreliable reduces the perceived threat. Unpredictability can exclude a person from the category of a credible witness. There are documented precedents in which individuals adopt erratic behaviors to avoid deeper scrutiny. Consciously or unconsciously, instability transforms into a form of armor. A third theory attempted to reconcile both perspectives: that Faniki could be simultaneously vulnerable and strategic, that trauma and calculation are not mutually exclusive. People subjected to extreme pressure often oscillate between genuine anguish and deliberate self-protection. In these cases, behavior can seem manipulative without there being malicious intent. Adaptation becomes a response to perceived threat. What complicates any definitive assessment is the absence of an authorized evaluation. No independent psychological evaluation has been made public. There is no legal determination regarding Faniki's credibility or capacity as a witness. In this void, public interpretation filled the space. Follower communities intensified their scrutiny. Video compilations compared posture, tone, and body language. Analysts measured pauses, eye movements, and speech cadences. While this type of analysis can be informative, it is also highly vulnerable to confirmation bias. Observers tend to see what they expect to see. Even so, the search for patterns continued. An element that reappeared frequently was Shiki's apparent awareness regarding surveillance. In some fragments, cautious gestures, controlled movements, and a tendency to scan the environment were pointed out. These behaviors may reflect anxiety. However, within a narrative saturated with alleged surveillance, they were interpreted by some as familiarity rather than fear. If the environment attributed to Yu Menglong's management was effectively one of constant observation, those who functioned within it might have internalized surveillance as the norm. This internalization alters behavior even when physical supervision is no longer present. People continue to self-censor, anticipating observation in its absence. This concept proves key to understanding the role Fan Shiki occupies in the story. From a legal perspective, feigning incapacity does not hold up easily under scrutiny. Courts rely on expert evaluations, documented histories, and consistency over time and contexts. Public perception, in contrast, is built upon narrative coherence. In this case, multiple narratives competed aggressively. While speculation increased, the authorities remained restrained. No public accusations were issued, no confirmations were offered. This caution, legally understandable, further intensified the suspicions of those who believed that institutional pressures were at play. What remains indisputable is the centrality of Fan Shiki in the unfolding tale, not as a confirmed perpetrator, nor as an exonerated witness, but as a figure whose behavior reflected the broader themes of the case: control, perception, uncertainty. The risk in this phase lies not only in wrongly judging Faniki, but in confusing speculation with truth. Digital investigations can illuminate patterns, but they can also distort reality when disconnected from verified proof. As the focus narrowed on Fan Shiki, the case reached a critical point. The narrative was no longer sustained solely by places, videos, or timelines. It was sustained by interpretation, and with that, deeper questions arose. If instability can be used as a weapon, if silence can be strategic, and if in certain contexts, survival can become indistinguishable from manipulation. These questions offer no simple answers, but they set the stage for the final phase of this file: